Well, I'm Daniel, and I have a special guest, JP Shafer. He is a really good friend and someone who has encouraged me to read the Greek classics. He has become very informed on the Greek classics, certainly the Greek epic poems, such as the one we're talking about today, which is the Iliad. So, hi, JP. Thanks for joining the conversation.
Really glad to be here. This is going to be a good time. Thanks for having me on.
Yes, sir. Yeah. So I want to start with a simple question. What is the Iliad for those who maybe have never read it before? What exactly is the Iliad?
Yeah, what is the Iliad? The Iliad is one of the great books of Western civilization. In fact, it's the first great book of Western civilization. It might be a good place to start just to say that the Iliad is one half of a pair. We refer to the works of Homer. We think that Homer was a Greek poet probably around the 8th century BC. We don't know a whole lot about him. There's some debate as to even whether there was a single man named Homer or whether it's a collection of poets throughout history. But whoever Homer is, there are two works attributed to him, and they are essentially two parts of one story. They're very different, but two parts of one story that centers around as its main setting the Trojan War and what happens within it and following from the Trojan War. So the first of those two is the Iliad. The second, of course, is the Odyssey. So the Iliad focuses on Achilles in particular and tells the story focused on him and his wrath, as I'm sure we'll discuss a bit more. Tells the story of just several days, maybe about a 2 week or so period within the final year of a 10-year siege of the Trojan War.
Gotcha. So you've kind of answered what the Iliad is about as well. What kind of genre of literature is the Iliad and the Odyssey, as you brought up?
Yeah, both are epic poetry. And so they are set in verse in the original texts. Depending on which translation you use, some are translated into prose. You don't have to read them in poetic form, but they were originally so. And the epic part of that title, epic poetry, that simply refers to a large myth. Myth in the largest sense. Myth is not necessarily untrue or historically inaccurate, although historical accuracy is not the main purpose of Homer either. But myth simply helps to explain for a people what truth is, whether by telling a story or by accurately relaying a truth. And in this case, the myth that is the epic poetry of the Iliad and the Odyssey helps to actually lay the foundations for Greek literature, for Greek society. And because we know that the Greek foundation or the Greek society is the foundation of Roman society and culture in a lot of ways, and then the Greek and Roman cultures are the foundation of the rest of European and British and through Britain, the rest of the Anglosphere world. The Western world goes back to these roots.
Interesting. So it's a long poem, in particular the Iliad and certainly the Odyssey as well. So a lot is said in the Iliad, in particular here. Let's focus on the Iliad. What does Homer want us to think about?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there are a lot of things that Homer wants us to think about in this poem, but he does tee us off with the very first word, in fact, of the poem, which in Greek is wrath, and specifically the wrath of Achilles. And so he really starts us on that trajectory and he follows through to the end. This is a consideration of the wrath of Achilles. And through that lens, we then, and remember, it's set in the Trojan War, but it's not so much about the Trojan War. The Trojan War and even the wrath of Achilles is something of a plot device, a setting and a lens through which to read a story that really is about human nature. It's about not only the detrimental effects of wrath and anger on both the one who holds that wrath and on those around him. There's a lot of that in both facets throughout the Iliad, but also other aspects of human nature, what it means to be a good man, what it means to be a good, flourishing society. Homer is using the Trojan War and Achilles in particular during this segment of the Trojan War to help us think through these great timeless issues.
Interesting. So we've brought up a couple characters, at least Achilles. You brought up Achilles. I'm not sure if you brought up Hector yet. I maybe missed that if you did, but let's introduce the characters. Who are the main characters in the Iliad?
Yeah, there are several worth mentioning. We have already mentioned Achilles. Achilles is the main character, at least on one reading. He seems to be the main character of Homer's authorial intent. He sets out the initial trajectory of the poem based on Achilles. So Achilles being perhaps the primarily main character, then comes with two others, one of which is Diomedes, whom we've not mentioned. He was another Greek soldier. Um, Diomedes spends the first portion of the Iliad really throughout several books. Diomedes serves as sort of a type or a foreshadowing of Achilles to come. So he becomes a very important character in that sense. And then you have kind of the foil or the counterpart to Achilles on the Trojan side of the war, who is Hector, as you just mentioned. So those kind of make something of a trio of warriors. Achilles, we know, is the greatest warrior. He's the greatest warrior of all on both the Greek and the Trojan sides. Hector, however, is the greatest warrior on the Trojan side. And both the reader and the Trojans, and the Greeks for that matter, everyone knows, it's the big elephant in the room throughout the epic, that Hector is the greatest on the Trojan side, but he does not compare to Achilles. Achilles and Achilles alone is the greatest warrior in the book. So if we back up, though, and just take a few more characters on either side, on the Greek side, it would be important to mention Agamemnon and Menelaus. These two are brothers, and Agamemnon serves as the chief leader of the Achaeans or the Greeks on that side of the Trojan War. So Agamemnon has been the one to raise the army in support of Menelaus, his brother. We can talk about some of the backstory there too, if time permits. So Agamemnon has raised the army. He's the chief commander of the army. But then you also have lesser commanders who themselves are kings of certain Greek city-states who have all come together to form the Greek army. So you have not only Agamemnon and Menelaus and Achilles, you also have big names such as the Ajaxes. You have Odysseus is big. You have Nestor, who we come to know further, for one, in the Odyssey, the story of Odysseus's return home from the war. So you have several big Greek commanders whose names are worth knowing and who are very exciting to follow through the rest of the story. Finally, then, on the Trojan side, a few more worth noting would be King Priam, who is Hector's father. Hector is the prince of Troy and the future king. Priam is his father. Hecuba, Priam's wife, the queen, Hector's mother, also makes a couple of entrances in significant ways into the story. There finally then is another couple made of, on the one side, Paris, who is one of the other sons of King Priam. He is Hector's brother. And Paris, then we know, is the new husband of the one who has stolen away the most beautiful woman in all the world, and that is Helen. Now, the key juncture here is, for those who don't know the story, that Helen, the new wife of Prince Paris, was stolen from Menelaus. Originally, she was Menelaus's wife. That adultery and stealing away of Helen is eventually what brings about the entire Trojan War and precipitates the rest of this story.
Interesting. Yeah, thank you for that. So it's a huge war, as you mentioned, a huge battle between the Achaeans and the Trojans. So that dominates the story. But can you talk about some of the major themes that one should look out for and that one runs across in reading the Iliad?
Yes, so wrath is actually a key theme, and that wrath we've already discussed it a little bit, but we do see the destructive nature of that wrath, both within Achilles and his own life and the degree to which we would want Achilles to flourish as a man. And we'll perhaps talk more about what it means for Achilles to be a man. But then you also have as a major theme throughout the work, the disastrous effect that his wrath has on everyone else. And that is wrath manifest in a couple of different ways. So Achilles, and perhaps we'll talk about just kind of an overview of the story, but Achilles spends much of the story just pouting away from the rest of the Greek army. That's one way in which this anger and wrath just kind of boils and manifests itself. And then, of course, later in the story, Achilles enters into the war himself and causes destruction of a whole nother kind. But you have destruction on the first hand because Achilles is not fighting. And so all the men are dying around him largely because of his wrath. And then he enters in, and all the more men continue dying around him because of his wrath. His wrath is nothing but a destructive force. But then you also have a couple of others that might be worth mentioning. The pride that gives rise to that wrath is a fascinating study throughout the Iliad. We as Christians recognize pride as the first sin in an Augustinian sense, and and that really is exactly the first sin of the Iliad that gives rise to the argument. It's a public argument that the Iliad begins with in the opening of Book 1, where Achilles and Agamemnon, remember the chief commander of the Greeks, are arguing over who receives certain kinds of glory and rewards for certain battles and sacks that have already gone on within the 10-year siege up to this point. And what you see is two very different personalities and two very different positions within Greek society represented in Agamemnon and Achilles, and the way that pride manifests itself in its own disastrous consequences. That then is mirrored in a really fascinating way between the gods immediately after, and you follow that throughout the rest of the book. Perhaps one more theme, if I have time to mention one, is xenia. And that is it's a well-known Greek word for hospitality. And this is really key, I think, to reading and really understanding and appreciating the Iliad throughout. So this xenia or hospitality for the Greeks is a key component, one of the primary components of their ethic or their moral code. And it simply states that a host has a moral and extremely significant responsibility to be a good host, a very hospitable host to anyone that happens to come into his home in the original sense. But also we see it manifest in interesting ways on the battlefield. And so for instance, we have in Book 6 a fascinating scene where two warriors, Diomedes on the Greek side and Glaucus on the Trojan side, they meet each other on the battlefield, and as they're about to begin fighting, the one calls out to the other, "Introduce yourself and give me the summary of your pedigree, so that I know that I'm not about to enter into a fight with a god that I would be doomed to lose." So to prove that each other are actually humans and that they should be fighting each other rather than one entering into warfare with a god, they both give their pedigrees. They summarize their family histories. And as Glaucus summarizes his family histories, just walking through the generations up to the present time, Diomedes realizes, and these are enemies about to kill each other on the battlefield. It's entirely unrealistic that such long conversation would have gone on before they actually raised their spears against each other. But as Glaucus tells his story, Diomedes says, "My grandfather hosted your grandfather in his home." And so what this means is we're friends. It goes back to this very important code of hospitality. And what it indicates for the reader is, firstly, there is a real deep recognition on the part of both warriors, both of whom share a very common culture of what it is to be a civilized man in a civilized society. And that not only rests on an intergenerational notion of society and our responsibility to really steward what our forebears have left to us. That's a huge component of the Greek understanding of society. They realize very, very well that they can tear down in an act of war in one moment what generations have built up to leave to them. And they want to be very careful not to do that. War is a necessity. They understand that they're at war, they have to fight, but they're not going to fight friends. And those friends stem to ones who were shown friendship, that sort of hospitality love by even their forebears generations back. And so then that friendship comes to a sort of love that we see manifesting throughout as well. For a society to flourish, for men to be civilized, you have to have rightly ordered loves, and you have to be loyal to the right people and the right things in the right ways. So what you end up with is Diomedes and Glaucus actually agree as friends in civilized society, as civilized men, not to kill each other, to turn away to go find other people. Presumably friends of their new friends, whom they will actually kill in battle and seek the glory. One other way that that manifests in a fascinating way is simply that that hospitality shown on the battlefield and its significance for instance, the civilization versus chaos that can so easily be descended into in warfare, is that when one party has defeated another party on the battlefield, if the defeated man has the energy and the opportunity to actually get on his knees and wrap his arms around the knees of the conqueror, the one who has won the fight. Say the lesser warrior has been disarmed or so. And so he kneels, he supplicates, hugging the knees, he begs for mercy. And that effectively to the Greek mind makes the defeated party a guest to the now host, who is the conquering party. In this sense, and we see this happen several times throughout the Iliad, where a defeated party hugs the knees and begs for mercy, begs to keep his life and have his body ransomed to the defeating warrior. Several times this happens. And the conquering warrior has a responsibility according to this code. They consider it a sin against Zeus if they then go ahead and slay the begging party. They have a duty, morally speaking, to actually let the beggar live, keep his life, and he'll be ransomed. And it's significant, as one author has just recently pointed out, that in those instances throughout the Iliad, when the conquering party refuses to show that love, to show that hospitality, that is repeatedly the very moments at which that order descends into chaos. The battle gets really heated, and a lot of men die really gory deaths when that xenia, that hospitality, has been rejected. So huge civilizational and moral significances here. Those are just a few examples, but what this does is it gives us an opportunity to reflect on what it means to be a good man in a good society.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Thank you, JP. Yeah, I remember that part about Glaucus and Diomedes, and I think that was very moving and very interesting. Can you tell us about the high points of the Iliad? Kind of paint the picture, the story, help us understand what's going on.
Yes, so let's begin with the backstory, simply because to really read and appreciate this, you need to have some understanding of what had been going on. It's worth noting that Homer was not writing this as an unprecedented story with no background, right? He understood that the Greeks who were reading this and hearing this already knew generally the scope of the Trojan War. So if we go to the beginning, what we have is, I've already alluded to Helen being the most beautiful woman in the world. And so years before the Trojan War, years before the Iliad begins, you have Helen with all of these suitors, Greek, basically future kings within the Greek city-states from around the Greek lands, who all want to marry the most beautiful woman in the world, the most beautiful woman of their generation. And so one of them is going to gain her hand, and the others are not. And the idea is she's worth killing over. The idea is, even in the lore, battles could be fought over Helen's kind of beauty. And so they all make a pact before she chooses whom she will marry. They make this pact amongst each other that whoever wins her hand has it solemnly. And any man who ever attempts in any way to take her away from the man who wins her hand, whom she ends up marrying, all the rest of the men will rise up with their armies to rectify the wrong. So that's the backstory. Now we fast forward to the time of the Trojan War when Paris, the Prince of Troy, has been visiting the Greeks, and he ends up, and there's a backstory to him too that we won't get into now, but he ends up seducing Helen, taking her home on the ship back to Troy, stealing Menelaus's wife. So what does this mean? Well, it enacts the pact. It means now someone has entered in, he has tried to steal and has succeeded in this case in stealing Menelaus's Helen away. And so all the Greeks now, based on the agreement that they had made years before, have a responsibility to join together. Agamemnon, then, the brother of Menelaus, who's been robbed of his wife, Agamemnon raises the Greek army. He calls the kings from all around. They all sail to Troy and they sack the city, seeking to get Helen back and restore the honor of Menelaus, whose wife has been stolen. So that happens, and then the siege that the Greeks lay on Troy lasts for 10 years. So 9 years have passed. We're in the final year of that 10-year siege. And then the Iliad begins. So at that point, the Iliad begins what we call in media res. This is a common theme or a common plot device, we might say, in all literature, but beginning with Greek literature. So it simply means in the middle of things, rather than Homer starting at the beginning and explaining all of this and telling a tale in a very conventional way. No, he opens up with Achilles and Agamemnon in a public argument over the glory that they are receiving and the sorts of honor and rewards that each one is due for their own positions in the army and in Greek society. So they disagree publicly. Achilles ends up being robbed of a prize that he is convinced he's due. And his response to that is, in his wrath, his anger, as the story begins, is he goes and he sulks. He just goes and he pouts at his tents and he walks along the shores where all the Greek ships are being kept, and he walks along and he prays. This is also significant about Achilles. Achilles is semi-divine. So his father Peleus is a human king. He's aging by this time. He's going to die soon. Achilles knows that very well. But Achilles' mother Thetis is the daughter of Zeus. She's a goddess. And so Achilles, this plays a large part in Achilles' own psyche and how he thinks about both the glory that's due to him and how he prepares for and wants to die. But all that to say, Achilles goes and he prays to this goddess that is his mother, Thetis, and he complains to her that his due has been stolen. Justice is not being done, and what he deserves, he's not getting. It's being taken from him by mean Agamemnon. And so Thetis goes to Zeus and she asks Zeus to ensure that Achilles will receive the honor due to him. So Zeus responds then by ensuring for as long as Achilles pouts and sits out the battle, the Greeks will be fighting in vain. The war will just go on and on and on, and the Greeks will not be able to win until Achilles enters in, and then he will receive all the glory for being the Greek warrior that comes in and initiates the winning of the battle on the part of the Greeks. So men die. He pouts. More men die. He continues pouting. And all the while, Agamemnon gradually comes to terms with the fact that he needs Achilles if he's going to win the battle. Otherwise, things are just going to continue doing poorly. And Agamemnon's own honor as the commander of the losing Greek army is in jeopardy. And so Agamemnon goes and he tries to get Achilles to come back, but Achilles refuses. So Patroclus, whom we should have mentioned before, talking about main characters, but Patroclus is the best friend of Achilles. Finally, Patroclus wants Achilles to fight. He wants to be fighting. He understands they're doing the rest of the Greeks a disservice by withholding their own contribution to the battle. And so Patroclus finally he gets for himself Achilles' permission, Achilles' blessing for Patroclus to go wearing Achilles' armor so that he will be thought to be Achilles on the battlefield and leading Achilles' men into battle. Achilles can stay and pout if he wants, but Patroclus is going to go and look like Achilles and hopefully raise the Greek spirit and threaten the Trojans who fear Achilles and so on. and Patroclus ends up being killed on the battlefield by Hector. So this then is a huge turning point in the story because Patroclus now is dead. Patroclus is Achilles' best friend. Now Achilles' wrath takes on a whole new meaning. Achilles now is less concerned with his own honor and he's far more concerned with revenge for Hector having killed his friend Patroclus. So that brings Achilles then well into the battle. Now the tide turns. Achilles comes in, the Greeks begin to win. Achilles kills many, many men, and he eventually kills Hector for killing Patroclus. He's unhinged at this point. He's furious. It's rage, and he utterly defiles for days on end Hector's body, which was a huge sin for the Greeks. And so eventually you have Priam, Hector's father, the king of Troy, who comes to beg Achilles. He comes and he kneels down and he kisses the hand of Achilles, the very man who has slain his son. And he begs Achilles, can I please have my son's body back so that he can enter into Hades according to Greek belief, and so that he will have a proper afterlife, and so that we can all give his body the due that it deserves. And Achilles relents, and he grants Priam the body. So then there ends up a funeral service for Hector. Uh, and we end the story on a very unexpected note, which is that Achilles grants Priam 11 or 12 days to handle the funeral rites for Hector. And he says after that, we'll resume the fighting. And then, of course, we know after that that the Greeks win. And we know all about that. But that's where the book leaves off. The book doesn't tell us about Achilles' death. It doesn't tell us about the Trojan horse that we know so much about. It doesn't tell us about the Greek victory over Troy. It simply ends with something of a messy resolution to the wrath of Achilles.
That's very interesting. Thank you for explaining that. You mentioned the Trojan horse not being in the Iliad. That surprised me. I was expecting to read about the Trojan horse, but it was a Trojan War without a Trojan horse in the Iliad.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And that
So
just goes to show the. Go ahead.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Well, it's just simply because telling the story of the Trojan War was not Homer's ambition. It's not what he set out to do. So it's just outside the scope of what he wants to do with Achilles and Hector.
What is your favorite part, JP, of the Iliad?
Yeah, there are so many good parts. It's a long story. It's 24 books of wonderful poetry. It as I just summarized it, and it was a long summary. You can imagine how long this book is if you haven't read it. Um, but I think out of all of that, my favorite part is book six. And that would be book six as a whole. I've already mentioned that book six is where we read of Glaucus and Diomedes having their lengthy conversation on the battlefield, and you see a lot about what it is to be civilized and live in a civilized society there. But more than that, you also see Hector in profound ways and very poignant ways being a man in full in a way that we never get to see Achilles being, because Achilles isn't. Uh, Achilles is a semi-divine, half man, half god, kind of a man in limbo who's concerned with his own mortality and how that mortality is going to play out and how it's going to bring him glory. Hector is a man concerned with being what a man is meant to be and fulfilling his duties. And book six, we probably don't have enough time just to get into book six, but I would recommend anyone who is interested perhaps in reading the Iliad, start with book six. And if you don't have time to read the whole Iliad right now, you can do that later. At least read book six. And if you just want a little taste and you're thinking about maybe reading the rest of the Iliad, start with book six. Book six is beautiful. But it tells in very emotional, very also true to life ways of Hector. What happens is Hector returns from war at the bidding of the gods, indirectly through a brother of his who has come to say, we need the gods' help here, and we need Hector to come, while Aeneas, who is a fascinating character who ends up being kind of a cornerstone of Roman tradition, right? He escapes, and the Aeneid is later written about him. But he comes to Hector and he says, while Aeneas stays on the battlefield, Hector, you need to come and rally the city. You need to come back within the gates, safe from the battle for a moment, but you need to tell your queen mother Hecuba, for instance, to gather together the leading women of the city and go pray and pray hard to Athena, because we need her help, because Diomedes is wreaking havoc on the battlefield and it's not going well for us, and we need Athena's help. Now, little does, and this comes into the tragedy that is this epic poem, but Hector, nor do any of the Trojans, they don't know that Athena is already dead set against the Trojans. She is expending all of her effort and energies on helping the Greeks win. They don't know that. So they go, and Hector gets his mother to offer prayers and sacrifices to Athena. He also visits other parts of his family members, and most beautifully, he visits his wife and his baby son on the city wall before he goes out. And in fact, I'll take just a moment to read this brief quote where his wife is pleading with him, please don't go back out there. We know if you go back out there, you're not coming back. You, she says, are they all understand he is the hope for Troy. And if he dies, and as soon as he encounters Achilles, everyone knows he will. That's the great likelihood. If he dies, Troy dies. And she says, why don't you stay here where it's safe within the city? And if you die, you know what's going to happen with me. Because if Hector dies, Troy is successfully sacked by the Greeks. And if the Greeks sack Troy, and this is a very accurate portent of what comes, what we know from later history and tradition actually happened. The Greeks sack the city, they violate the women, they kill the babies. And so this is Hector standing before his wife whom he loves, his child whom he loves. And his wife is saying, if you go out there, not only do you die, but I will be destined to violated servitude, and they will kill your son. They'll throw him off the city wall, and he'll plunge to his death. And Hector's response is this from Emily Wilson's New Translation. He says, come on now, you must not be too sad on my account. No man can send me to the house of Hades before my time. No man can get away from destiny, first set for us at birth, however cowardly or brave he is. Go home and do the things you have to do. Work on your loom and spindle and instruct the slaves to do their household work as well. War is a task for men, for every man born here in Troy, but most especially for me. And as you trace that through, what he's instructing her to do is simply do your duty, and I'm going to do mine, because we are mortals on this earth, and that's all that we can do. We don't control the fact that we have been placed in a generation doomed to die. War has come upon us. The Greeks are going to win, but we can live well in light of the circumstances that the gods have destined for us. And so he says, you go and do your duty. Go sit at the loom and manage your household well. And I'm going to go to war, which is my duty, and there's no way out. And I'm going to die anyway. I might as well die properly. I might as well die in the way that my duty calls me to do. And eventually, toward the end of the story, when he does in fact meet Achilles, and Hector does meet his doom and is ushered into Hades, we're told by Homer exactly where his wife Andromache is when that happens. And she is sitting as a faithful wife at her loom when she learns what has happened to Hector. So it's a beautiful portent. If we were to get more into it, more into the details, I would probably cry. It's a beautiful, beautiful story. And book 6 and the story of Hector just brings it to life.
Yeah, thank you for talking about that. That's very good, JP. So you've talked a lot about why Achilles fought for glory and out of rage. Why did Hector fight?
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful question following from this. Hector fights because he knows that it's the right thing to do. The same thing is not necessarily true of Achilles, right? Achilles actually refuses to fight when it would be the right thing to do, and when he finally does fight, it's simply for revenge. He's the better fighter, but his motives are not where they really ought to be. Hector, on the other hand, doesn't want to fight. He's not in it for revenge. He's really not in it for glory as much as he's in it for duty. And he wants to be an honorable man whom, even as a husband and father and prince of a city, all of whom are doomed, he understands that it's better to be doomed with honor and righteousness, having done one's duty, than to be doomed as a coward. And so we see a tremendous image of courage in Hector. We see in Hector really a beautiful picture of virtue on the whole. And it says a lot about Homer, by the way, that as a Greek writing for Greeks, he makes the most virtuous man in the whole story the enemy. He doesn't paint Agamemnon out this way. He doesn't paint Achilles out this way. He chooses Hector to make, in the modern sense of the word, the hero of the story. Hector is the one who is worth emulating as a man.
Very interesting. Thank you for that. So as we start to close, we've talked about the major themes and the story as a whole. Let's zoom in a little bit and talk about some of the main characters. What do the best men do well? The book describes these men by name, and there are specific statements attached to each to give you an idea of what they are like and who they are. What does the reader walk away with when they read about these men? What do they do well?
Yeah, it is a whole class of men who are considered in this way. And as you mentioned, they're each accompanied with epithets, which is epithets just being you have a brief kind of a descriptive title that often comes either before or after the name when it's spoken within the verse. And in ways, that's just a poetic device to make it easier to memorize, to make it easier to recite, to make it easier for the listening audience when these poems were originally recited, to follow along and keep up with what's happening. It gives you kind of a chance to breathe within the recitation of the poem. So some of those are more informative than others. But so you have, for instance, crafty Odysseus. You know, Odysseus is a very he's known for being a very strong thinker. You know, Achilles is kind of the inverse of that, and he's a strong fighter. He's not known for his mind; he's known for his body, and so on. And you get to know Hector, for instance, is master of horses. And that's an epithet that often accompanies Hector's name, and so on. But as a whole, without getting into any of the one of these, what these best men do well is to answer in brief, they do well whatever they're called to do in the moment. So the word best, if we back up and just consider the Greek perspective here, the word best in Greek is aristos. And that bestness, that quality, if we can, that excellence, as it's frequently translated, that quality of being the best is arete. And that is it's the sort of excellence that we seek to find in virtuous men, but it has much more to do with what kind of a man he is than it does really his actions. To be the best is not just to be the best fighter. We know Achilles is the best fighter, but is he also the best at everything else that he's called to be in society? Hector is called to be a fighter, but that's not all that he's called to be. To be Aristos for the Greeks, you have to be a good fighter when you're called to fight, but not such a fighter that you're fighting when you're not called to fight, or vice versa. It also means if you're a husband or a father or a son or a brother, that you're a good husband or father or son or brother. It means that you're a good farmer, maybe not the best farmer, but you are a good farmer in peacetime, that you can be productive and contribute to society in other ways than being a warrior or in being a son or so on. So it's not unlike what the Romans would call virtus, or what we call virtue, right? That's the derivative. Virtus for the Romans was just manliness. That's kind of what arete is for the Greeks. It simply has to do with being a good man, and that's going to manifest itself in different scenarios. The French, modern French, have yet a different term called savoir-faire, which is just being uh, being prepared to do well, confidently, and with the requisite knowledge and expertise in any given circumstance, right? So someone with savoir-faire can flourish in any circumstance, not because of what he is doing, as much as because of who he is. It's about being a man's man in the fullest sense. So our current society, of course, thinks of heroes, even like James Bond as being that, right? We look at someone like James Bond, and he can fight when fighting is needed, and he's going to be the best at that there is around. But when it comes to carrying on a good conversation in an armchair about great books, you have the feeling that James Bond would be good at that too. He's not just a fighter who knows nothing else. He's not all brawn and no brain. Um, Finally, I would just say from a Christian perspective here, we want to be reading this as Christians. And whether we think of it as arete or virtus or savoir-faire, or whether we just think of it as virtue and what a man is meant to be, we understand that Jesus is exactly this for us. We can talk about the best men in the Odyssey or the Iliad, but those are shadows of the best man. And the man that is Jesus Christ, we look at his ministry on earth as told in the Gospels, and he is brawn and brains, to think of it in those terms, right? He is not only a tremendously impressive intellect, a genius when it comes to literary familiarity and being able to tell a tale and know the human heart and pastor a flock of disciples, but he also survives in the wilderness. He can camp. He's a carpenter. He knows how to work with his hands. He's a fully formed, mature man. And so what you see in Hector as opposed to Achilles, and Achilles is flourishing as someone who is, or seeking to flourish as someone who's half man, half God. That's different. But what you see in Hector, who's flourishing as a man, just a mere mortal, as are we, is he is a man in full. He's a mature, fully formed man who knows how best to act, not only on the battlefield, even if he's not the best warrior. In fact, there's a line toward the end of the book 23 or maybe book 24, where Homer just he says as well, it's while Achilles is chasing Hector around the city wall, while Hector is deciding how and whether to face Achilles and die. And Homer just tells us, he says, Hector was a fine man. He was a good man, but Achilles was the superior fighter. That's all Achilles is in this equation. He was the best fighter there was. But if you want to know what a fine man is, you look at Hector, who managed his duties to gods. He managed his duties to mother and father. He managed his duties to brother and sister-in-law, to wife and son, and to his comrades on the battlefield. And he did so well.
Thank you. So, when you think about all the great men in the Iliad, you've kind of answered this, but who was the best man, and why was he the best man?
Yeah, I think we can say this reading it both through a properly Greek lens, through authorial intent, which we as conservatives always want to do. The last thing we want to do when we first come to a text is impose on that text our modern garb. C.S. Lewis was fond of wearing the armor of the medieval knight if you're going to step into a story about medieval knights. Don't try to make the knight like you are, right? You need to understand the knight as he is. And it's exactly the same thing here with the Greeks. If we want to understand Homer for what he's telling us, we need to read it first as much as we can from a Greek perspective. But then, before we begin applying it to our lives, we need to think thoroughly as Christians about what this means. So this is both a time-bound book and it's a book that gives us timeless truth. And so I think from both of those lenses, as an initial reading in the Greek worldview and as a secondary reading from a Christian worldview, I think we have to say that although Achilles is properly speaking in the classical sense the hero of the story, he is not simply a man, right? And so we understand every time we approach Achilles in the story, we approach him as something larger than we are. He's not meant to be a man as we are. And in one sense, none of the heroes are. But in another sense, there is that very clear difference between Achilles and Hector. And Hector, to my mind, I think both for the Greeks and for the Christians, for Homer as he wants us to interpret the story, Hector is the picture of the best kind of a man that you can be. So I think it's Hector.
So, in closing, JP, this has been very interesting and very informative, and I really appreciate the conversation, and I hope the listeners have as well. Why read the Iliad? It's a long book. It's difficult, perhaps one of the most difficult books you could read. I'm thinking about a mother or a father. With kids. I'm thinking about maybe a high school student. Why take the time and energy to read the Iliad?
Yes, the short answer is because it is worth it every time. Worth it for anyone who will take the time and worth it repeatedly as you read it more times than once, hopefully, throughout one's life. As I said before, it's a great book. It's one of the supreme great books for Western civilization. And part of what it is to be a great book is that it stretches you. Um, it should be hard to read. It should be, in this case, it's a long book that even stretches you. Perhaps if you're used to reading shorter books and only shorter books, that you'll have to have some perseverance and maybe tenacity to actually make it through. Well, that's going to grow you in its own right. But even more than something like the length of the book or the difficulty of the book, it stretches you as any great book must, but it stretches you towards what is true and good and beautiful. That's not to say that Homer, as a pagan Greek who didn't know Christ, uh, has a perfect worldview that does actually paint an accurate picture of all that is perfectly true and good and beautiful. He didn't know Christ. He didn't know the triune God. It's not a Christian book, and the last thing we want to do is try to pretend that it is. We have to take it for what it is. But for what it is, it's supremely valuable because even for us as Christians, and we're not just modern Christians saying this, Christians throughout the history of the church have said this about the Iliad in particular. The Iliad gives us uh, the opportunity and even the necessary promptings sometimes to ask good questions that we might not have even thought to ask without it, to consider things that are worth considering, and thereby pushes us toward a greater appreciation and comprehension of what is true and good and beautiful. And so it stretches us toward what's true and good and beautiful. But finally, it also stretches us toward what's true and good and beautiful in conversation with our forefathers. So this is not a new book that stretches us. That would be fine and worthwhile in its own right. This is a way that we can be stretched toward the excellent things that we're called to meditate on in the same way and with the same helps, in conversation with our fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers and all of the great men and women throughout the history of Western civilization. That's a conversation that we need to enter into. And so why read the Iliad? Because it will grow you as a person, as an individual. and as a member of society. You know, we often think of newspapers and keeping up with the news as kind of a civilizational requirement, right? To be a good citizen, you need to keep up with the news. I think a lot of us are taught to think that way, and rightly so. But that's the sort of keeping up with news that's required to be a good, informed, productive citizen. But to become a citizen at all, you first have to receive a citizenship. You have to receive a society of which you're a citizen. So before you can start reading the news and being a good citizen, you have to actually enter into maybe some harder texts than your average newspaper article and come to terms with what is the civilization that I have inherited and that I now, in the 21st century, have a responsibility to steward. It's only after reading the great books like the Iliad and the Odyssey that then we can take newspaper articles and know what to do with them. Because the whole purpose of knowing how to be a good citizen now is to steward what we've received from the past and take it to where it needs to be for the future. We can't do that if we don't know where we've come from the past and how that paints a picture and sets a trajectory for the true and the good and the beautiful in the future. As Christians, then we also see huge foreshadowings of Christ. It should grow us in that way. Achilles is the main character here. He is, as I've already mentioned a couple of times, he's part God, part man. And once again, that is just a shaded shadow of Christ himself, who comes not as part God, part man, some odd conglomerate, you know, of confusion and this third being. Christ comes as truly fully God, truly fully man. And he does what neither Hector nor Achilles nor anyone else in any pagan literature can do. And as we read of Achilles, as we read of the other men and semi-divine characters and so on in Greek literature, it helps prepare us to better appreciate, by contrast, the glory of the gospel in the face of Jesus Christ.
Well, JP, you've certainly clearly thought a lot about this book. You've read it well. Thank you for encouraging people to read the classics, to take them seriously, to think about them deeply, and hope we can have many more conversations about classic books like this in the future. I hope that many watching will take up the Iliad and read it and benefit from it, and hope this video has been beneficial. JP, thank you very much for the conversation. Very interesting and fascinating conversation about a very important book, epic, the Iliad.
Thank you, Daniel.